please state your name.
Well, I am Dr. Jeanette Parker,
And
I'm from Medical Whistleblower Advocacy Network, and we are located in Washington, D.C.
Great. Do you affirm everything you will say in this interview is true and that HEAL and the HEAL Report YouTube series has permission to use this interview?
Yes, I do.
Okay. And when did you start the Medical Whistleblower Advocacy Network?
Well, in 2001, I witnessed firsthand the coercive and abusive nature of the teen residential treatment programs when they tried to force my former foster daughter into one of these programs in Washington State. My former foster daughter was running from her biological family, was basically homeless, and had showed up at my door after I hadn't seen her for years.
Wow.
The last she had been in my home was as a foster child in 1993, and that was 8 years previous.
Wow.
And a lot more trauma had happened in her life, and she had aged out of the foster system and was considered by the court to be an independent adult. So she's basically on her own. I got her in touch with social service to make sure she had access to medical care, a GED program, a therapist, and a social worker who arranged the necessities, food and temporary shelter kind of
Right.
thing. But she needed more permanent housing, so I arranged and took her to an interview for her placement in a publicly funded group home where she would get housing and financial support for 18 months. She would have received food, a shared room, and access to laundry services, mail service, and a case manager. But wanting her independence, she declined supportive housing, but she still came to see me sporadically during 2001. A woman who worked with me in the veterinary clinic was directly involved in forcing children into these abusive rehabilitation programs. When her daughter was a teenager, this mother gave permission to have her own daughter kidnapped from her home, dragged across state lines, and incarcerated against the child's will into an abusive residential treatment center. Her daughter was finally released from the facility, but her daughter's anger at her mother's involvement in forcing the abuse on her never went away.
Right.
As a parent, this woman still asserted years later that this brutal abuse was necessary to keep her own daughter in line. So in 2001, this coworker of mine tried to convince me that my former foster daughter, who was 19 and a half years old at the time and living independently, should be grabbed and forced into a substance abuse treatment program.
Wow.
But she was a very traumatized young adult, and that's why she was in foster care, and her problems were related to that. She had a complicated history of trauma, neglect, and abuse. And I didn't believe that my former foster daughter should be abducted and put without her consent into an abusive program.
Right.
So I immediately objected, resisted the efforts of this woman and her friends to abduct my former foster daughter and place her in the rehab program, which might, of course, forcibly drug her with off-label psychiatric drugs.
Right.
But when I refused to comply with their demands, and in spite and over my objections, persons unknown did abduct her in 2001. They held my former foster daughter incognito and threatened me over the phone.
Wow.
And as a former foster parent, I had no legal rights to protect her, but I reported multiple incidents to law enforcement. Then in July of 2002, I got a telephone call from my former foster daughter for the very last time. She soon after that disappeared completely, and I never heard or saw her again.
Oh, my goodness.
And at this point, I don't know whether she's alive or dead. So that prompted me to want to know who in the hell are these abusive people in these rehab programs, who they really are, why they had such apparent political power, and why were they able to do such abusive things without any consequences for their actions.
Right.
And these criminals acted as if they had authority and did things under color of law and without any concern for legal consequences. I was able to discern later that they were involved in a shadow elite power group called the Federation of State Physicians Health Programs, specifically the Washington State Physician Health Program. And further investigation discovered that they were essentially a straight Inc. type group for medical professionals, and they did extortion, and coercion of professionals with medical licenses.
Wow.
So I started Medical Whistleblower Advocacy Network informally in 2001. And at that time, I had been working quietly doing investigative research and providing information to Wes Fager. I think you know him.
Yes.
Probably. I was particularly interested in how the medical professionals who were mandated child abuse reporters and who certainly had been in contact with the abused victims had still been silenced. I interviewed hundreds of people, including many medical doctors who were experiencing difficulties in their workplace, some of whom were whistleblowers, some of whom were threatened with the removal of their medical licenses for exposing medical fraud.
Yeah.
Some were mandated reporters of child abuse, whose lives had been destroyed after they came forward to protect the child from abuse. I reached out to Dr. Stanton Peele. Are you familiar with him?
No.
Yeah. He was involved in the doctor's substance abuse fiction program.
Okay.
To understand more fully the substance abuse treatment programs and specifically the Physicians Health Program, which is like straight ink for doctors. I found that many doctors had been threatened with or even placed into similar abusive treatment programs and then coerced to obey their captors. I even interviewed doctors who were involved in the abusive programs to determine what type of discipline the medical board actually did to them.
Right.
The Washington State Physicians Health Program is a nonprofit which obtains its power and authority through a contract with the Washington State Department of Health. The Washington State government admitted that they did no monitoring of the WPHP's behavior or actions, did not hold the WPHP to any state regulations or standards, and had granted them quasi-governmental immunity to do whatever they wanted to targeted medical professionals. I found in my research that multiple doctors placed in the WPHP's monitoring program had committed suicide.
Oh,
many were suicidal because of the abuse that they suffered at the hands of the WPHP. And this abuse was similar to what the survivors and victims of straight ink had experienced.
Right.
So basically my network of informants, survivors, and victims consisted of a wide range of people from a wide variety of professional disciplines, not just medical professionals. I spoke to medical malpractice attorneys, personal liability attorneys, QUITAM attorneys, even attorneys specializing in constitutional law. I even spoke to family court judges that have been involved in straight ink and other cases involving abusive residential treatment facilities. I spoke to police officers, FBI agents, DEA agents, and U.S. attorneys. I spoke to a wide range of survivors, those from straight ink, WASP, Teen Challenge, wilderness programs, and a variety of abusive religious programs. I worked with Wes Fager, whose son had been in straight. Wes himself was a computer expert.
Okay.
And he encouraged me to reach out to Tim Field, who was a British computer science expert. Tim Field was an expert in bullying in the workplace. Through Tim Field, I met Drs. Ruth and Gary Namey. They were both PhDs, and they ran a workplace bullying institute in Washington State. So with Tim Field's support and help from Dr. Ruth and Gary Namey, I testified to the Washington State Congress. My oral testimony to the Senate Commerce and Labor Committee was regarding bullying in the workplace and its relationship to hiding criminal activities such as medical fraud and money laundering.
Right.
So I thus made a public statement to the Washington State Senate regarding how medical professionals are silenced by direct hostile bullying in their workplace and how bullying behavior can escalate to violence against a medical whistleblower or a mandated reporter. I was, of course, encouraged by my friends to put up a website of my findings and go public through a blog talk radio show, which I did. I did interview a lot of people on my blog talk, including numerous people from residential treatment abuse situations. And over the years, I also participated in many whistleblower conferences and events in Washington, D.C. Because of the unique nature of the information I gave to Wes Fager and Tim Field, they encouraged me to go public with publishing the Medical Whistleblower Canary Notes newsletter. The first issue of my Medical Whistleblower Canary Notes newsletter was officially done in January 2006.
Okay.
And that was done in memory of Tim Fields, who had just died.
So did looking into what was going on with this Washington Health nonprofit, did that lead you to looking into SEED? Is that that's how you started?
Yeah.
And your foster daughter's situation. I don't know. Was both of them led you to look into these?
I always felt that you need to know who's in charge. You need to know who has the power. And I feel that you have to follow the money and follow the power. And so that's what I did. I followed the money and tried to determine how these abusive residential treatment programs have got so large and so powerful.
Right.
So the first program I evaluated for residential treatment was the SEED. The SEED was based on a much older drug rehabilitation program called Synanon.
Yeah.
Synanon ultimately became the Church of Synanon, which was a criminal enterprise and a cult and was shut down. But the concept of confrontation, forced confessions, and lifelong rehabilitation originated with Synanon. Much of the initial research on SEED had been done by Wes Baker. The SEED was of course you probably already know this, a chain of controversial juvenile drug rehab programs that were founded in 1970. In 1971, the U.S. Senate Judiciary Committee, the Subcommittee on Constitutional Rights, which was under the directorship of Senator Sam Erwin, began an investigation of the U.S. government's role in behavior modification and published a report in 1974. And this likened SEED behavior to brainwashing methods and said that they were like the methods employed by North Koreans against the American servicemen during the Korean War. So SEED was essentially defunded by the National Institute of Drug Abuse, the NIDA. They had originally gotten their SEED money and started their organization because the director of the NIDA was Dr. Robert DuPont, Jr.
Yeah.
And Senator Erwin had directed DuPont to comply with federal human rights protections on human subjects of experimentation. Now, these are international standards on how to treat people who are subjects of a medical experiment or behavioral experiment.
Right.
So the U.S. Congress demanded that SEED issue an NID human consent forms to SEED participants and to the parents, acknowledging that the children were participating in the human experimentation.
Okay.
Well, of course, parents don't want to sign that. They were withholding that information from the parents. So these are the ethical and moral standards of research of using human beings as subjects. These regulations requiring protection for human subjects are in medical, sociological, and behavioral research. The federal regulations are codified in U.S. law as the common rules and are derived from international law, the Nuremberg Code, and the World Health Organization's Declaration of Helsinki, which the U.S. was a signatory on. So I realized that these regulations were used to protect human subjects were a powerful tool to stop the funding of abusive residential treatment facilities. And I thought maybe it would potentially shut them down.
Right.
So I focused my research on that aspect of it, the human rights protections for human beings used in medical and behavioral experiments. So you certainly see, in looking at STRAIGHT, you can see how these residential treatment facilities gained their power, how they were able to expand and be able to avoid being shut down for the abuses they did, because NIDA's director, Robert DuPont, left NIDA, became a STRAIGHT consultant. STRAIGHT went national, became the largest juvenile drug rehabilitation program in the whole world.
Right.
Of course, it morphed into a million different programs, such as Kids Helping Kids, Pathway Family Center, Life Growing Together, Kids in New Jersey,
ARC,
Adolescent Center, even for that matter, Teen Challenge.
Right.
Straight Inc. used former NIDA Director Robert DuPont as part of the shadow government. And so, I started looking at these relationships. As a former high-ranking federal official, he sat on multiple advisory boards, quasi-governmental organizations, and think tanks that helped formulate U.S. policy on substance abuse treatment. And so this resulted in a blending and blurring of the relationships between these government institutions and their relationship to the residential treatment industry.
Yeah.
Increasingly, crucial governmental decisions affecting the public are actually made in these consulting firms and boardrooms and NGO think tanks. And persons such as Dr. Robert DuPont Jr. or even Melvin Sempler perform multiple roles across multiple organizations, and sometimes very difficult to find out where one entity or role ends and another begins.
Right.
Dr. Robert DuPont had been the founding director of NIDA, the second White House drug czar, and also a paid straight consultant. So essentially this was a shadow elite that exists in social networks. They operate in and connect themselves to various official and private spheres, and these shadow elites violate the codes of governmental accountability, both public and private. They advance their own personal agendas, usually through personal relationships. They're very friendly. They're like family. And although some activities are public, the full array of what they do is almost very difficult to detect. And that was certainly true for Straight Inc. and for other programs involved in the war against drugs.
Right.
Drugs, so,
So
medical professionals like Dr. Robert DuPont, Dr. Ian McDonald, and Dr. Richard Schwartz were a part of the Straight Inc. network and refused to report abuse. But not only that, they played a crucial role in providing a sense of legitimacy to the treatment given at those abusive residential treatment facilities. So these MD doctors perpetuated and supported coercive, cruel, and degrading treatment of persons needing substance abuse and mental health treatment. So they expanded the influence to the White House and to Congress through the Drug Free America Foundation and ultimately through the President's New Freedom Commission on Mental Health,
right,
which was established by President George Bush in 2002.
George W.
Yeah, George W. Really pushed this into being the standard of treatment for children instead of, making sure that the centers were up to appropriate human rights protection.
Right. Yeah, and they introduced Teen Screen to try to get high school students into the programs.
Absolutely.
We just, in July of 2014, the governor in Washington State finally signed a law regarding the misuse of IEPs, so that now any kid who's going to be institutionalized has to have a public due process hearing open to the press and open to the public, and they have to have a fair trial to determine whether or not that is even warranted, instead of just these behind-the-scenes teachers or officials signing off on how they're going to use their special education funding to put kids in programs instead of provide services to special needs kids within the community like they're supposed to with that money.
Yeah, under the ADA there are protections for civil rights, but as you know, Teen Challenge never abides by that. And as a matter of fact, people have shown me paperwork from Teen Challenge in Florida where when you sign your kid into their facility, you've given up your parental rights.
Wow.
And so if later the family doesn't like what they're doing, you don't get your kid back.
Right. I think a lot of the programs get this one of those blue laws, one of those laws that really shouldn't be on the books anymore because it's outdated and doesn't apply in modern society, but they'll file. We've seen this in Idaho and a couple other states where programs or certain program models are grandfathered in as orphanages, and that's solely what they're licensed as is an orphanage. So they make you sign that you don't want your kid and are banning them at an orphanage, but they don't tell the parents that they're an orphanage as part of the scam. We're a treatment center. Of course, we're not an orphanage. No one would even think to look it up. But we try to find all that information and say if they're licensed at all. A lot of times, Teen Challenge we haven't found that Teen Challenge has been properly licensed as anything when we've looked into it, or licensed at all. Very rare. Like I think in the Arkansas Teen Challenge Ranch, they are acknowledged as a private Christian school through the Department of Education in Arkansas, but that's the only acknowledgement we've found, and that's the only Teen Challenge where we found they had any kind of such acknowledgement at all, was the one in Arkansas.
And the amazing thing is that the Drug Freedom Foundation and the President's new Commission on Mental Health all want to send everyone to Teen Challenge. It's such a wonderful program.
Right.
And it's not licensed. It's not inspected. It doesn't obey any of the standards. Its staff are not trained in mandated reporting of child abuse.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, their contracts say in their contracts that specifically, at least at some of the Teen Challenge, they all differ a little bit. Each contract is slightly different, even when they have the same parent company. But with Teen Challenge, they've said, we're not a treatment program, we're not a medical or mental health facility, and you acknowledge this, initial here. And then under that it says something like, you acknowledge that Teen Challenge is solely a discipleship program, and that you're enrolling a loved one in order for them to become a disciple of the Teen Challenge program. So
in other words, you're enrolling them to be a religious person.
Right.
Because they're taking the religious exemption.
Right.
Yeah, they're walking in on all those exemptions created for the religious organizations. Yeah. Yeah, they will think of more and more devious ways to avoid being responsible for their actions.
Right. We're seeing that too. When did you file your first report regarding institutional child abuse with the UN? I know we worked on you with that. I'm just for the audience's sake.
I actively participated in providing the United Nations with informational materials since 2008, including a report to the UPR in 2010, a report to the CAT Committee in 2014, a follow-up report in 2014 to the second cycle of the Universal Periodic Review of the USA, and I'm now in the process of reporting to the Human Rights Council regarding the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. So that's the most recent one I'm working on right now.
That sounds really interesting. Recently, you sent 2 documents. Now, was the one you're working on part of that, or is that a separate document, the one regarding the political that you
the accountability report card?
Yeah.
I think I sent that, and to the Voice of Victims shadow report to the ICCPR. Yes, those are 2 of the reports that I've recently done. Also, very importantly, I sent a written report about residential treatment abuse to the United Nations in 2011 with the help of Mr. William Wernshaw Sr.
Yeah.
And the help of many of the survivors. And I know that you've seen that and probably have that on your website.
Right, yeah, we helped out, too, with that one.
Yeah. So that kind of shocked the UN. I mean, that report really shocked them.
Oh, wow.
Because they really had no idea. And at first they said, you must be, exaggerated. I said, no, hell no.
Yeah.
If anything, I am, not telling you the full extent of it, and you need to really look into it. And so they started looking at some of the end notes, the reference notes, and of course some of them I've referenced to various websites that are run by survivors, and Fornit's being one of the big ones, and yours, of course, and you know them all. And when they started going in there and seeing what was being written, they realized that this was a huge problem. And, of course, there have been several congressional reports done. George Miller of California had been very active at getting this exposed, but he never got it shut down,
Right.
We did the congressional reports, but we didn't see any changes that would substantially make a difference. So I guess my feeling was that within the U.S. government there wasn't a desire to change it, that this thing was so big and so well connected and so politically powerful and so financially powerful,
right,
that even a congressman didn't know how to shut it down.
Right. I remember that during George W.'s administration, Ashcroft refused to investigate when George Miller, as the chair of the Education and Workforce. So they always change it. It's Education and Labor, and then sometimes I see it as Education and Workforce. So I'm not sure
we
if those
also did it under the Education Committee, I think. At that point. Yeah.
So I've been wondering, do you know what's happened with that legislation? I haven't checked to see if anybody's taken the banner from George since he's retired.
No, they haven't, unfortunately, to the best of my knowledge.
I was curious if Tom Harkin...
Part of that might be because of the change in the status of, the Republicans versus the Democrats in Congress.
Right.
And the reluctance of persons of Republican persuasion to allow government to interfere with any private business.
Right.
Yeah, they don't want to have regulation. They don't want to have someone looking over their shoulder. So, But unfortunately, we are letting these substance abuse treatment facilities violate human rights norms.
Right.
And and when we are held out in front of the United Nations and we claim that we are so good at protecting our citizenry and we have the best human rights protections in the world. Wow.
Yeah, that doesn't ring true.
Government does believe that. And then this report is placed in front of the UN. It did surprise the UN representatives. It really did. And so, I believe that it got quite a bit of reading, and we did manage to eventually get to the point where I've got the ICCPR, the committee, the Human Rights Committee that reviews the applications of the ICCPR. I've got them looking at these issues. I have them, they actually listed number 15 as non-consensual psychiatric treatment, which,
that's wonderful.
That's what I think that this is.
Yeah.
Non-voluntary by our victims. Our victims didn't agree to this.
Right.
Non-consensual treatment of them and abusive treatment of them. And so I did get it listed as a list of issues. It has never been before listed as a list of issues in any review of the United States before.
Wow, that's excellent.
We have made that happen. And that was a long process. Well, since the initial involvement with the UN's CAT Committee and the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders, I've tried to gain better knowledge of the UN process so I can actually present these cases of abuse and mistreatment effectively. There are so many victims, and their voices aren't heard, and there's so little done to prevent the further abuse. So I felt it was necessary to hold our U.S. officials accountable.
Right.
And to make the ethical and moral standards of the UN treaties actually meaningful. So I did take training, I think I told you this, with the Physicians for Human Rights, which is a internationally recognized expert on torture and mistreatment, and so that I could understand the UN standards for what is torture, cruel, and degrading treatment under the CAT statute.
Right.
And what doesn't meet their criteria, because I needed to understand why they had originally refused to review Richard Ray Bradbury's case. I mean, he presented his case along with William Wernschau and others to the UN in 1999. And so I was shocked when it came back with just a form letter saying it was denied. Oh, I said, wait a minute. Denied? What do you mean denied? How could you possibly deny that Richard had been tortured?
Right.
It was just, I just couldn't understand it. So I wrote letters, picked up the telephone. I finally managed to harass the UN. They finally called me back to find out who I was and what the hell I wanted, And,
persistence is key to getting any...
well, I was very persistent.
Yeah.
But, it was very important to me to be heard, and so I wrote to the UN CAT Committee. I spoke on the phone with several members of the CAT Committee and also to the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders. I spoke in 2004 to Claudia Groston. He's from Chile, and he was at the American University School of Law in Washington, D.C., and I was there for a program on whistleblowers, so I spoke to him. And in 2008, I spoke at great length to a man who really helped me understand things, and that was the UN Special Rapporteur on the Promotion and Protection of the Right to Freedom and Opinion and Expression. That's a long thing to say, isn't it?
Yeah.
Frank LaRue, he was from Guatemala. And I said, I need to understand this. I do not understand why you sent a form letter to us.
Right.
If you had any idea of the great effort that it took to, number one, be able to recount all that, number two, be able to present it in a format, Richard has stepped into these shoes reluctantly. I don't know if you're familiar with his case, but he has stepped into these shoes very reluctantly. He was a very hurt person, but we lost the person who was going to do the public part of the, presentation.
Right.
And so when that person was no longer with us, it was like we were going to lose things if someone else didn't step up,
Yeah.
And Richard courageously stepped up, and at a great risk to himself, because they weren't beyond doing retaliation, pretty abusive retaliation. And of course, when you're already traumatized, that's hard to take.
Right.
And so, I really felt that the UN needs to understand how much went into these cases.
Yeah.
And how many people Richard actually represented. I figure there was at least at that point maybe 200,000 people who had survived some form of abuse and residential treatment at that point.
Right.
There were 50,000 in straight England.
Well, I think the report I just recently saw in California, this is regarding abuse in elderly facilities, elder care long-term facilities, not youth, but there were over 200,000 reports of abuse in 1 year.
Right.
In California in elderly long-term care situations.
Yeah, and so I did look a lot at elderly, too, because Elaine Manuel, I'm not really familiar with her, she could stop guardian abuse.
Yeah.
Website. She's done a beautiful job of bringing forward some of those situations with the developmentally disabled, physically disabled, and the elderly. Not so much children in residential treatment.
Yeah.
But she has brought forward a lot. And AARP did an excellent study on guardianship abuse, too. And so when I heard that Teen Challenge was making themselves into the parents of the children that were put into Teen Challenge and taking away parental rights and making themselves guardians,
right.
I realized that we needed to look a lot harder on guardianship laws, guardianship accountability, who's in charge, how the decisions are made, whether or not we track these cases and know what's going on with them. And the truth is, the court system doesn't know.
Right.
They don't know. There's 1.5 million pending guardianships in the United States at this moment. And the courts do not even know whether those are children, adults, or elderly, or disabled. They don't know.
Wow, that's
the courts do not even track which of these wards that have a guardian are given experimental psychiatric drugs.
Right.
They have actually authorized and allowed children as young as 2.5 years old to get.
Oh, my God.
Given Seroquel, liquid Seroquel.
Oh, my God.
And I know one case that Jim Gottstein handled. Do you know Jim Gottstein, attorney Jim Gottstein from Anchorage, Alaska?
It sounds familiar.
Yeah, he runs the psychrights.org network, and he's an amazing man. He's worked diligently on these issues for years. He's very knowledgeable. But he has presented a lot of cases, including cases at the state level, state Supreme Court level, and he's actually won cases. So he's very knowledgeable on that.
We were talking before that about the guardian abuse, and I was...
Oh, yeah. So I included that in my voices, voiceless victims, voice of the court. I included about guardianship because I think that's an area we can really see the command responsibility. One of the things that I learned from my training in the UN CAT information having to do with torture was that from the standpoint of the United Nations, you have to prove that the federal government actually knew that the abuse was happening and did nothing to stop it or was actively involved in doing it.
Okay.
So if you have a federal prison and a guard is abusing a person in a federal prison, well, that's obvious. The command responsibility is clear.
Right.
But when you have Straight Inc., who is a nonprofit, takes money independently from people's private insurances, then proving command responsibility and jurisdiction is the problem. It isn't. Our problem with Ray Bradbury's case wasn't that the abuse wasn't torture. I think the UN could see that.
Right.
The problem they had was jurisdiction, number one. And number two, we had to prove that it was torture to the level of torture, number one. And number two, if it wasn't to that level, we had to prove a systemic pattern of abuse. I said, well, we got that in cards.
Right.
I mean, we don't have any problem about abuse in residential treatment facilities because the UN needed to have that hammered to them. They needed to understand this was a pattern of abuse, that there were wasn't just one, or two, or three people.
Right. It is totally systemic, and it's not one or two bad apples.
Maybe hundreds of people, and that the abuse in so many of them, so many of these cases, does, in my estimation, as someone trained in Istanbul Protocol, does meet the standards of torture.
Right.
It just does.
So what was in the accountability report card? Are there some areas you'd like to talk about that people can see in the report?
Well, the accountability report card, one of the things that was important there is that we did get issue number 15 to be about non-consensual psychiatric treatment.
That's really
have that
amazing.
As an abuse and something I could report on.
Yay!
so I was like, wow, now it's in the list to get my report in about it. And so when it got on the list of issues, in part because I provided detailed information regarding two cases to the Organization of American States. That is the organization that oversees numerous international treaties for the U.S.
Okay.
And all of North and South America, And the Organization of American States, their office is right here in Washington, D.C., but the fort is in Mexico. So in 2012, I said, I have got to get the details to them because the UN needs the details.
Right.
And one of the problems the UN has is that they're not living in our country.
Yeah.
They don't live in our country, and they have no way of knowing. I mean, you realize that these organizations hide what they're doing from even your parents.
Right, right.
Getting the information in front of the UN in the shadow reports. I mean, people say to me, well, they didn't get back to me. They didn't tell me anything. It's just like throwing reports into a black hole.
Okay, so the accountability report card, that got the rule added so you could report.
Yeah, I was allowed to then report because I had done two cases to the Organization of American States. I had two cases in front of the Organization of American States. One of them was to Dartha Fisher. Are you still there?
I'm here.
Okay, which was presented on the floor of the United Nations at the CERD committee hearings in 2014. And the other case was Mark Taylor, who was a citizen whistleblower to the Food and Drug Administration concerning the danger of psychiatric drugs causing violence. And these two cases I did in great detail. I mean, there's several hundred pages and multiple annexes and timeline and,
Right.
I mean, I really worked them up, and I put them in 2012. So they formed the basis of my report to CAT in 2014 stating that we had problems with torture and abuse, cruel and degrading treatment under CAT for non-consensual psychiatric treatment. And that allowed me to get it on the list of issues for the ICCPR. And so my report to the ICCPR, as you probably see, they ask very specific questions, and you're only allowed to answer the ones they ask you.
Oh, wow.
So they asked me about special consideration for past abuses. And so I was answering under issue 15 that my assessment was that the U.S. government's actions as a nation were not satisfactory.
Right.
To ensure that all cases of unlawful killing, torture, and other cruel and degrading treatment, unlawful detention, enforced disappearance were effectively, independently, and impartially investigated. And I went into great detail about why I felt it wasn't. And then I stated that the USA did not make sure that perpetrators, including in particular persons in position of command, were prosecuted and sanctioned, and that the victims were provided with effective remedies.
Right.
And so that's what that report basically states.
When you use the word torture to describe conditions at youth facilities operating in the U.S. or under U.S. based control, What forms of maltreatment are you identifying as torture?
Well, so many actions of those doing residential treatment abuse are considered by the United Nations to be torture. I mean, psychological torture is just as traumatic as physical torture, and the psychological wounds of both physical and psychological torture last a lifetime.
Right.
It's actually the psychological scars that last longer than the physical scars. The coercive and abusive methods of straight and all the other residential treatment programs were actually designed to obliterate the sense of self, instill fear, make the teens be obedient to authority. So under the UN, torture is the deliberate infliction of severe pain by one human being against another. And thus it leaves particular kinds of mental and psychological scars. And this trauma is so different from other traumas because torture is a violation committed in secret and in spite of official denial. And certainly that was true for Straight and all the other facilities. I mean, Straight was constantly in violation of the governmental regulations by locking kids in bedrooms with windows nailed shut, denying bathroom privacy, denying contact with their families. Children and young adults were forced involuntarily into research studies, while Straight didn't allow them to receive mail, gifts, or visitors. They were kept under strict surveillance 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Some of the abusive methods that could be considered torture that these centers do are, sleep deprivation, beatings, sexual humiliation, sexual assault, prolonged sitting, standing in a forced position. A lot of the kids did that. Isolation and detention for prolonged and indefinite periods of time, forcing one teen to abuse another, and prolonged denial of rest, denial of sleep, denial of food, denial of water, and also lack of adequate hygiene. I mean, they've even used pharmacological torture in some of these places, including toxic doses of sedatives, neuroleptics, and paralytics.
Right.
So these abusive methods still exist today and are going on in numerous residential treatments under a variety of names. And these abusive methods can all be considered forms of torture, cruel, and degrading treatment under CAT.
I wasn't sure if I wanted to.
The United Nations has an established forensic protocol for evaluating torture. It's called the Istanbul Protocol.
Okay.
And it's a set of guidelines to document torture and its consequences, and really to obtain any justice through the court system, even the international court system. The victim is expected to testify and provide recounting of what happened to them in order to provide a record of what has happened. And this is hard for victims. This truth-telling may have reparative value for some of them, but it can be deeply traumatic.
Right.
They surface the old memories, the old wounds, and so, it's very problematic that we don't have, one of the things I realized in pursuing all this is we didn't have forensic torture evaluators willing to do U.S. citizens on U.S. soil.
Right.
I went to the National Torture Programs Consortium this past winter, and they all talked about serving immigrants, asylum seekers, refugees, migrants, people from other countries.
Okay.
They absolutely don't do U.S. citizens. And if you pick up the telephone and ask them to do a torture evaluation of a U.S. citizen, they'll tell you no.
Wow.
So the truth is that we don't have a way to reparative justice for our U.S. torture survivors.
Right.
And so I believe that that's one of the problems we have in accountability. When I go to the ICCPR, I need to say to them, you understand, we don't have torture programs that will evaluate the victims I'm talking about.
Right. The second document you submitted to HEAL was the report titled Voiceless Victims. Did you want to talk about systemic problems? I know we've gone over some, but and what you mean by voiceless victims?
Well, the voiceless victims are persons who have had their rights removed by the court, the words of the court. And some of our voiceless victims don't even know that's happened to them.
Right.
I mean, they get locked in one of these facilities and they can't get out, and they don't know why. It's because behind closed doors they've done an emergency guardianship over them and taken away their life service.
Right.
And so then when you have a family member that wants to get the child released, then you find out, oh, gee, we can't get that kid released because they're now claiming they have guardianship over him or her. And certainly the voiceless victims also include children in foster care.
Right.
It includes persons who have been criminally convicted as being mentally ill. It includes persons in psychiatric detention or treatment. It includes even persons who are elderly with Alzheimer's and dementia that are in nursing homes. And so there's a huge number of people that are currently been legally declared to have legally dead.
Wow.
Have no rights. And what I found is once they do that to a person, I can't even go to their congressman or senator at the U.S. Congress and get help because the congressman says, well, we don't handle matters that have to do with the judiciary, and once they're wards of the court, they're under the judiciary. So I talked to the Supreme Court Justice, and say, okay, all right, the congressman is responsible, so who is? And he says, well, it's the state court, the Supreme Court in each of the states.
Okay.
And I said, okay, well then how do you make sure that the Supreme Courts are doing what they're supposed to do under international treaty law?
Right.
Because they're not responding to the UN or reporting. So the state Supreme Courts are the highest level when it comes to guardianship. There is no guardianship system under the federal court system.
Okay.
And the Supreme Court doesn't directly supervise the state courts. They hear appeals, but they don't directly supervise the state courts.
Right.
And so essentially no one's watching what's going on. So when I wrote my report, Voiceless Victims, Wards of the Court, I talked about that system and why, we don't even know what's going on with the wards of the court. We have over 1.5 million people in this legal death situation with no one watching what's going on. And that is, in that kind of situation, behind closed doors, with a person who has no legal right to refuse, that is where the most horrendous abuse occurs.
Right. What recommendations do you have for improving oversight and stopping institutional abuse? Would you recommend? One of the things I do is whenever there's an election, if we're electing judges, I email every candidate regardless of what they're applying for. Or what, I guess it's not an application when you run for government, but I consider it an application when I'm reading the qualifications of candidates. I read through that. I email all of them, and I ask them if they know about this issue and whether or not, and what their position is on that issue. I don't say, I've taken a position until I get their response because I want to make sure that they honestly respond. So I'm pretty ambiguous with the language I use. Just have you heard of residential treatment programs for youth? And have you had any experience, personal or professional, in placing a child at a residential facility for youth or a wilderness program for youth? So I don't say whether or not I think that's a good thing or a bad thing. I just ask. And
what were the responses? I'm interested.
Yeah, so, well, it depends on the person. Most people said they'd never heard of the issue, that they would have to look more into it. There were a couple of people who asked me why I was asking the question before they were willing to even discuss it. And I don't usually say, well, I want to know because I have taken a strong position on this issue, because then again, that's why they're asking me why I'm asking, so that they can tailor their response or not respond if they feel it would injure their candidacy in any way to respond in opposition or whatever. So I did have one candidate who emailed me and said that they had a sibling who had placed their child in a facility, but they themselves had never placed a child in a facility, and that they would be willing to look at the issue. But that still, I was like, well, it depends on if you feel it was, I don't know, those things. You know, I just wait and see what they say. Some of them don't respond. It was really weird. A few years ago, this was back when I was in college, so I should probably say 10 years ago or so, because 2005 is when I graduated. I took a class on homelessness. It was called Homelessness 101 at the University of Washington. It was a social work class, and we had to volunteer with a local homeless organization that provided services to local homeless. And I contacted all of the homeless teen centers to see if any of them did it. This was about candidacies. This is just about me volunteering outside of HEAL for a class, right? So I contacted all these homeless shelters and homeless services and asked them, do you put kids in these facilities? One of them said, that's none of your business. And I said, it is my business. If I'm going to be volunteering for you, I'd like to know what you do. So if this is part of what you do, I'd like to know, because that's a concern. And then they didn't get back to me. So I ended up volunteering for the Teen Feed program, which wasn't a shelter program. It was just a soup kitchen program. And because they were the only ones that I found that provided services to homeless teens that did not advocate for placement in these private programs.
Yeah, because it's the only program around.
Yeah.
Unfortunately. Yeah. That's the problem.
And I also look at what judges do, like, or any candidate, but, like, you know, we know Michelle Bachmann was really involved with Teen Challenge of Minnesota.
Oh, yeah.
You know, and Romney had Simbler and Litchfield as his co-chairs for the 2008 election. So we can see where there's those political ties. I just try to find out, I try to find OpenSecrets.org and see who's giving money to what candidate. We've seen where we can see some of these facilities. UHS, for one, has a good government fund, and they have registered lobbyists who are CEOs for their programs, who are registered lobbyists in California and elsewhere for affecting legislation. So I try to see where the influence peddlers are peddling the influence the heaviest, so we can get a better idea of maybe who needs to be voted out of office and who needs to be voted in.
Yeah, well, we need a lot of eyes to watch what our government officials are doing.
Right.
We really do, and it's hard to keep track of everybody and what they're doing, and for some groups like judges, it's harder to judge.
Yeah.
What they are actually doing, whether they're doing a good job or not. And I don't know whether the judges could answer the question, how many persons have you handled who have been in guardianship?
Right.
And how many of them were children? How many of them were elderly? You know?
Yeah.
I mean, that's a simple question. It's not asking something about a particular person. It's not privileged information. But you could ask them if their court even keeps track of how many people are in guardianship. Do you even know are these people in guardianships, or do you not even keep track? You'd be surprised how many of these courts, these state courts, don't even keep track at all.
Right.
Of who's in a guardianship situation. Can you imagine being thrown into a guardianship with someone you don't know who just wants to use you as a way of making money for themselves, and then not being able to ever again have anything to say about your own life.
It's crazy.
And the judge who put you there doesn't even remember you exist.
Wow.
I mean, really, we have to do something about that system.
Definitely. Yeah, we're finding that in a lot of situations. Right now I'm trying to obtain I asked the Washington State Department of Health and Social Services whether or not, I asked them 3 questions. I asked them how many foster care children had been placed in private residential or wilderness program settings, how much money had been spent on those placements, and what the vendor list was. Where are they? Yeah, DSHS said they don't have that information. They're not required to keep such reports. And, yeah, that's what I was told, that they're not required to know where Washington's children are and how much money are being spent on them when they're charged with, being...
Well, this is interesting because one of the cases that was kind of tangentially related to my foster daughter's situation is she was originally a foster child in Vermont State. So one of the foster children in Vermont State was abducted from Vermont State and was taken down to New York City and forced into a prostitution ring.
Wow.
And then she was force addicted to heroin in order to make her comply with the sexual demand. She was like 14 years old.
Oh, my goodness.
And she then died.
It was terrible.
And her death was a horrible, tragic situation. Well, that kind of made everybody in Vermont say, well, where are our foster kids? Do you know where they are?
Right, exactly.
From Vermont or in New York being used as prostitutes. I mean, didn't you know this girl was missing?
Right.
And so Vermont, started tightening up those reporting requirements because they looked at it and they had no idea.
Wow.
All of a sudden, the Vermont Congress wanted to know where are the children that are wards of our state.
Right.
How many more of them are down in some ratty apartment in Brooklyn,
Right.
And and I was pretty involved in talking to the mother of that girl that died. And I worked also with the police chief of the borough in New York that had found her body.
Wow.
So I knew quite a bit about that case. But so sometimes you just have to push it, and unfortunately a tragedy, make them sit up and pay more attention. But possibly, using that case from Vermont might wake up the Washington state government to paying more attention to where the wards of the state are.
Right. I'm definitely planning to do that. I'm working on... I first requested that data August 7th, 2014, and it's now March 30th, 2015. In less than, it's just about 4 months and 1 week. In 4 months and a week, it'll be a year since I made the request to know where our children are, our foster kids.
Yeah.
And they still haven't answered. They've answered. They've sent me letters. First they said that they would have the information for me by December 17th. Then I didn't get anything from them, so I wrote them after the holiday season, after New Year's, and said, hey, you said December 17th, what's going on? I didn't get anything yet. And they said, oh, sorry, it's going to take us a little longer. You can expect something on January 9th. We need a couple more weeks. On January 9th, I didn't get anything. I gave them another week, and I still didn't receive anything. And so I contacted them again, and they said that I should expect to get something by May 29th. And so now I'm waiting for May 29th so I can write them again if they haven't sent me anything by then to say, okay, well, now it's May 29th, and now we're 3 months, 2 months away from being a year without getting this FOIA request met. If I were a paid journalist and needed this for an investigative report, I don't even know what I would do. I would give up on reporting on this issue because who wants to wait or who has the time for years and years on a FOIA request for one story if that's what they're looking into?
I'm wondering if you could use the court system to make them pay more attention. I don't know how to do that, but it would be interesting to do.
It's just such an absurd thing. The similar thing happened when I started researching the public school system in Washington State regarding the IEP abuse. I contacted the Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction. That's the name of the Department of Education office and website here in Washington State. And they told me they don't keep that information at the state level, that they don't know where Washington students, public school students, have been sent and how much money has been spent through special education funding on those placements, on those private placements, that I'd have to contact each individual school district. There were approximately 200 school districts. I contacted all of them. Only a little more than 60% got back with me and answered my question. The rest of them either refused and said we're not required to create such a report. It's not in our mandate, so we don't do it, and we're not going to do a special report because you requested it. So I got that as a response from some of the school districts. Some of the school districts were forthcoming and just gave me the information. Some of them made me jump through hoops and sign special forms and send them, money for the information, so I did that. But in the end, I think it was over 60%. It might have been closer to 70%, like 67% of them did actually give me the information. But we found they were putting kids in WASP programs, in the Brown School, CEDU programs, Provo Canyon School, a number of other facilities that didn't make any sense. Like one of them was a program in Idaho that's licensed solely as an orphanage, but they advertise as a treatment, behavior modification treatment center for behavioral challenged school students, and they advertise as a school, but they're not licensed as a school. They have no academic credit. It's the same thing, but it's ridiculous. And I'm like, how is it that our public schools are sending kids to private facilities that aren't even meeting the needs of the kids? And that was the purpose for sending them in the first place, was that the public school says we can't meet the needs of these kids, so we're sending them to a specialty facility that can meet their needs. And then they're sending them places that don't meet their needs and even fall further away from meeting the needs in the public schools themselves. And they're spending millions and millions of taxpayer dollars on it. I found that the low estimate, based on the information I received from Washington Public Schools, that they spend a minimum of $30 million, and it was way more than that. It ended up being way more than that because I had no idea. After I did that report, I submitted it to the Washington State Ways and Means Committee, and they opened an investigation, and that's what resulted in the legislation that passed last July to stop the abuse of IEPs. And one of the things they encoded into law was that school officials couldn't receive compensation or kickbacks of any kind for placing a student at any private facility, because that was one of the major problems they were finding, is this whole kickback scheme.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't even find that. I mean, I thought it might be going on, but I had no proof of it. I just found that there was millions of dollars being spent to serve what looked like a few hundred students, but according to the Ways and Means Committee investigative report, it ended up affecting tens of thousands of students, not the 250 that the OSPI was reporting as the total number who had been placed in out-of-district services or placements. That was their, but they said that was the information that maybe was reported to them from the districts, but it turned out that thousands of children were affected, not just the 200. So it was millions of dollars, way more than I had initially estimated based on the numbers I had gotten from OSPI that were being misspent, and how those could be better spent providing, supports and proper academic services here in our public school system, that they were just misspending their special education funding. That's one of the reasons I'm reluctant to support additional funding of public schools, because I feel like they're abusing the funding they already have and misusing it for personal gain when you have public officials, especially, who are receiving kickbacks for these placements.
Yeah. You wonder if you're ever going to get to the end of all this.
Right.
You're keeping up the good fight, that's for sure, Angela.
Thank you. You too. We love what you're doing also, and we're happy to help at any time.
I do it on a different level, but it's for the same basic goal.
Right. Well, I think it's excellent, because if you can get UN attention on it, years ago, this is probably right after high school, I still support Amnesty International, but I was supporting Amnesty International a little more than I spend time on now. But I knew there were human rights abuses occurring in the U.S., and I had called Amnesty and said, why don't you investigate U.S.-based abuses? And
they don't touch anything in the U.S.
Right. They said they would lose their funding.
Absolutely. Absolutely. That's true of all the torture programs. Every single one of them. And that really shocked me, because I had torture survivors I wanted to get torture evaluations for.
Right.
And that's what I was told. And then the interesting thing is, when I walked, kind of into the world stage with this residential treatment abuse issue, no one at the UN was speaking about it. And the UN most of the people who were targeting torture and talking about torture, we're talking about Guantanamo Bay and Camp X-Ray and
Abu Ghraib,
and and that's what they were talking about. So the entire torture discussion, if you were read the information that's in front of the UN, was exclusively about U.S. abusing people in, military detention or prisons in other countries. It was all under the Alien Tort Statute.
Okay.
And I said, but where's all the U.S. torture victims that I know?
Right.
I'm sitting here looking at tens of thousands of torture victims, and they were like, well, that's, those torture victims, they would tell me, well, they can, if they've really been tortured, they can go to court and sue.
Wow. If they can afford an attorney, and if they can't afford an attorney, if they can find an attorney who's willing to take it on.
There is no statute for torture under U.S. law.
Right.
None. Because when the black men, the 206 black men who were brutally abused by John Burge, which was a Chicago, Illinois police officer, and he tortured these men brutally. I mean, held electric probes to their genitals and pushed them against hot radiators, and held a gun in their mouth and told them they were going to shoot their brains out, and forced confessions out of them.
Wow.
Two of the men, I think, were actually, because of their forced confessions, even though they were innocent, were actually executed.
Wow.
For even though they were innocent. And it turned out that there was, a massive pattern of police brutality. You can't say that's not a government official. I mean, this is a police officer in a police station abusing prisoners in a jail,
Right.
So, and you can't say it's not torture because it was for a forced confession. That's what they were doing it for. So it definitely met the statute for torture under international law. But even when the U.S. attorney and the special prosecutor assigned by the federal DOJ was sent to look at the case, they could not prosecute it under any statute that said anything about torture, because all the torture statutes have to do with foreign soil, foreign nationals.
Wow.
They don't have to do with U.S. citizens on U.S. soil. So they were able to take an aggravated assault and battery. There's a huge difference between torture and aggravated assault and battery.
Right.
You know, it's huge. And so when I talked to the UN about my torture cases, and the U.S. was basically saying we don't torture people in the U.S. If it ever does occur, it's only it's not systematic. It's not a pattern of torture.
Right.
And I said, well, what about John Burge? And everyone got quiet because that was an ACLU case. And the documents were all in the public record. You know, I mean, it had been well publicized in the media. And I said, well, what about John Burge's victims? Did they get redress? Did they get reparations? Did they get prosecutions under torture? Can you honestly tell me you don't think they were tortured?
Right.
You know, and...
Well, there was a horrible case out of Florida in the last couple of years where they turned the hot water up to the point and locked a prisoner in there, and it was so hot his skin came off his body, it burned him to death. The water was so hot it burned the skin off his body, and if that's not torture, I don't know what definition anyone would say is torture. But the fact is that we don't have laws to govern it. It just doesn't exist. And so I would say that alone is a violation of our obligations under CAT. Right.
We have no legislation that covers how you could prosecute someone in the U.S. for torturing a U.S. citizen on U.S. soil.
Right.
I mean, I should think we should protect our own citizens for torture.
You would think, yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Especially children. I mean, really.
It's unbelievable what goes on. Is there anything else you want to add?
Well, I guess I just wanted to say that torture is something that happens behind closed doors, and even in the U.S.
Right.
You know, it's not something that only happens at Camp X-Ray or Guantanamo or Abu Ghraib. And our victims are suffering in silence.
Right.
They have fear, guilt, shame, anger, disillusionment, insecurity, humiliation.
And disenfranchisement,
What happens is so personal and highly traumatizing. And they can't speak about it, even to family and friends. Sometimes they can't even come to terms with it themselves.
Right.
It's so hard for them to tell me their stories. And so that's the reason why I feel so important that I be able to present what they tell me to a torture evaluator that can give a forensic evaluation that will stand up in court, someone with an MD, someone with a doctorate in psychology. Because our torture survivors do need to be able to tell their stories. But they also need to be able to move forward with their lives.
Right.
Some of them want to have justice by getting criminal prosecution for the person who did it. Others want compensation. You know, they want a reparation. All of them need rehabilitation, and we certainly want to prevent it. We want to prevent it from occurring again, and that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to hold people accountable, you know, in the Washington State system and make them understand that they can't just say, well, we don't make reports about where we put kids.
Right.
You know, because denial of the wrong makes the psychological healing more difficult.
Exactly.
so many of the victims I spoke to, their torture and their abuse has even happened even 10 or 15 years ago.
Right.
And they're still suffering with it. They're still trying to come to grips with it. And so, the truth is the United States has signed the UN Convention Against Torture, and it has an obligation to investigate, prosecute, and punish those who do torture, even to U.S. citizens on U.S. soil. And we can't just continue to deny its existence.
Right.
And we have to provide a system for rehabilitation to the survivors. And by that I mean a lifelong system, counteract the deep-seated trauma that this kind of abuse leaves on its victims. And we need to provide adequate forensic evaluations so that there is truth-telling.
Right.
And a memory of the abuse, a history of it kept in the records so that we acknowledge that it did occur.
Right.
And it is morally and ethically unacceptable. And we need to have a robust program of forensic evaluations for the U.S. torture survivors so that they can go to court and effectively face their abusers. And we need to enforce human subject protections in the Common Rule, Nuremberg Code, and Declaration of Helsinki. And so I try to do my little bit,
Well, that's wonderful. You do a lot.
What I was so surprised about is that Amnesty International, which is considered to be, the gold standard for investigating torture, they wanted nothing to do with any of the people that were tortured that I talked about.
Wow.
Yeah,
they'll touch prison issues in the U.S. once in a while, but it's mostly death penalty issues. I mean, I don't really see them. I follow what they do. Most of the alerts I get from Amnesty are political prisoner alerts regarding other countries' abuse, like the Chinese locking up the Tibetans or something of that nature.
Yes. And there's always somebody on another foreign shore. So because they get their money from people in the United States, they never attack anything in the U.S.
That's crazy.
Yeah, they don't attack anything in the U.S. on U.S. soil, and they certainly don't do any torture cases that involve torture on U.S. soil. In a private institution, definitely not.
Right.
And my concern is that no one's looking at these other than you, me, and the survivors.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I'm hoping that's changing. But we'll see. I know that there's some problems, but that's an understatement. But I'm hoping we can start really getting things done. I know that they just introduced legislation about to ban abusive youth programs in California, I think. That just got introduced. And I know that there's one that was introduced in New Mexico, and I know that there's another one dealing mostly with, I think, the foster care placements happening right now in Massachusetts. So I'm hoping those bills all get the attention and support they deserve, and that we can keep on keeping on and making sure that states, know that the citizenry is watching and we expect something to be done about this.
Yeah. Pull the bad secrets out into the sunshine.
Right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you for the interview.